Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Heritage Lunch and Learn on 90 years of the City of Vancouver Archives. My name is Sarah Carlson, and I'm the Program Manager of Vancouver Heritage Foundation. And I have the pleasure of being joined this afternoon by Bronwyn Smyth, Heather Gordon, and Kira Baker. We're all really delighted to have you here with us for this virtual event. Before we get started with this afternoon's presentation, I wanted to take a moment to recognize the diverse history and cultural heritage of Vancouver, and that the city as we know it today is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We ask that wherever you're joining us from today, that you reflect upon the knowledge of and relationship you have with the people whose lands you made up. One of our aims as an organization is to give context and provide resources to better understand the historic legacies we live with today, and the systemic injustices that continue to exist. We all have a responsibility to learn from the uncomfortable truths of the past and the present, and to work together going forward. So for those of you who may not be aware of Vancouver Heritage Foundation, we are a registered charity that raises awareness of the vital contribution that heritage makes to a vibrant, inclusive, and sustainable community. We advance the appreciation and conservation of our city's diverse heritage places, as well as their stories, through our educational programming like this Lunch and Learn, special projects, information resources, and grants. We're really excited to continue to offer these Heritage Lunch and Learns virtually. The lunchtime talks feature current heritage projects and topics, and we're really excited to have staff from the City of Vancouver Archives on team to share their exciting milestone with you. So we're really grateful to have Bronwyn, Heather, and Kira here to share their experience and insights with us on the City of Vancouver Archives special anniversary. So I'm going to pass things over to Heather to get us started and introduce the team. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you for the land acknowledgement. Bronwyn and Kira and I are also joining you from the unceded territory, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh today. I'm just going to briefly introduce my colleagues. Kira Baker, who will be speaking in the middle part of the presentation, is our main reference archivist these days. So if you visit our reading room, you will most likely encounter Kira, and she'll be one of the first people helping you with more complex research questions. Her colleague Bronwyn Smyth is our archival assistant, also in the reading room, and Bronwyn's really our first contact with registrations and reading room orientations when you visit the reading room. And she's going to be telling you a bit about how we're celebrating the anniversary this year. I'm going to kick things off with the first part of our presentation. I'm the city's city archivist, here for a very long time. So if you want to ask me some of the history of the last 20 years, I welcome any kinds of questions along those lines. But we're going to begin what I hope is a relatively short presentation, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, with an overview of the city archives, a little bit about the history of the institution, and I'll turn things over to Kira to talk a bit about our holdings in more detail and our services, and then, as I mentioned, to Bronwyn about how we're actually celebrating the anniversary. The bulk of the time today, are really looking forward to hearing lots of questions from the archivists. From the audience. We formulated this as a ask us anything kind of event. So hopefully you'll have some wide-ranging questions for the team and I. So without further ado, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the background of the City Archives for those of you who may not be familiar with our origins. We trace the beginning of the archives back to Major Matthews' appointment as city archivist in 1933. Now, Major Matthews was one of those collector historians, amateur historians that a lot of cities do have. For Vancouver, it was Major James Kett Matthews. He came to the city in 1898 from Wales via New Zealand, and pretty much started collecting as soon as he arrived. He would gather up photographs and maps and all kinds of ephemeral things, three-dimensional things, and made that very much a hobby for the next 20, 30 years. He had a long career with Imperial Oil, collecting through that period of time, had a bit of a timeout for that in the 1920s, and by 1929 he was looking at trying to find a way, or actively finding a way, to turn that hobby into a formal archives for the city, and started advocating with council very strongly for that. Now, 1929, 1930 was not really a good time economically for the city to consider creating a brand new department, and the city never did bite on that at the time. But in 1931, the council finally relented a little bit and gave Matthews a small amount of space in what was then the annex south of the Carnegie Library. So the Carnegie Community Center at Hastings in Maine was the city library at the time. City Museum was in an annex south of that, and Major Matthews had a small amount of space there to house the collection. And he was given a small grant through the library board to purchase additions to the collection. For Matthews, that still wasn't really good enough. He wanted a formal archives department, kept lobbying for that. And in 1932, council finally relented, gave him a small stipend for himself out of the library board budget and a small increase to that operating fund, but there was no archives department per se. Matthews was very much during that short period of time functioning as an archivist in the library and not as what he felt he should be, which was a formal city archivist. And it was finally in 1933 where Matthews had badgered council enough that they finally officially appointed him city archivist on June 12th. And that's why we trace our anniversary, or the institution's establishment, to June 12th, 1933, which makes this year our 90th anniversary. And we're looking forward to celebrating that because it's a way of raising our profile after a very long pandemic. And we've tried to come up with a way that minimizes some of the effort for staff, because we've got a lot of things on our plates these days, but also gets us back out in the community a little bit more and reminds people that we're here. Bronwyn's going to talk in more detail later in the presentation about how we're doing that. Just to finish off about Major Matthews, the photo on the left there is Major Matthews in 1941. At that point, he's on the 9th floor of New City Hall at 12th and Cambie, up in the turret. And that was space he desperately wanted to be in City Hall, so he finally got that from council. On the right-hand side of your screen is one of his assistants, Margaret Giles, in 1936, when he had small space. He had a bit of space in the old City Hall and in the Holden building on East Hastings Street. And you can see that's very typical kind of archives office with a lot of files and cabinets where Matthews was holding all of his subject files and things like that. Now, that quest for space was one of the things that he continued to hound city council about throughout his tenure as city archivist, right up to his death in 1970. And the terms of his will, they got very complicated, but part of it involved, well, a demand which wasn't all that legally enforceable, but never mind. Matthews wanted the city to build a building for the archives collection. And if the city didn't do that, he threatened to have all of the collections sent to BC Archives in Victoria. Again, the city relented, not so much because of Matthews, but because a single building for the archives solved a problem at City Hall. And that problem was where to put all of those records, the city records that were filling up the hall post-Second World War. And the result was, on the next slide here, the building that we're now in and that the three of us are speaking to you from today, our site in Vanier Park, which was the first purpose-built municipal archives in Canada. It opened in late 1972, right next to the Museum of Vancouver and the H.R. MacMillan Space Center. We're now the second largest archives in British Columbia, and of course, the official repository of the City of Vancouver's archival records, the records of permanent value. There's an annual budget of about $1.5 million altogether, and about 11 staff persons working here. 8 of us are regular staff, the rest a mix of temporary and casual. And just like in 1970, and well, in Matthew's time since 1933, part of the city clerk's office. The mandate, as a lot of you I'm sure know, is to acquire and preserve all of the records of permanent value of the city government and to make those accessible, but also private sector records and other recorded information that document the city's history in some way. And that's very much consistent with this Canadian concept of total archives, which means government archives hold records from private organizations and individuals, as well as the records of their sponsoring government body. That's unique to Canada. In other countries, like for example, the United States, you would see those private sector records appearing in, say, state archives or in special collections libraries and that, or manuscript libraries in universities and that kind of thing. Here in Canada, it's kind of one-stop shopping within government archives. There's lots of specialized archives outside of government, of course, but most of the government archives you'll find will be following this concept of having both. 60% of the holdings these days come from the City of Vancouver, and about 40% are those private sector holdings. And the city records, well, they come to us as a result of the city's records management program. If any of you have questions about that, we can go into all kinds of detail later. But bottom line is we have a very close relationship with our corporate records management colleagues up in the city clerk's office. We work with them to write rules regarding how long city records are kept in offices and whether or not they ultimately come to the archives or whether they get destroyed at the end of their life cycle. And that decision about whether they're transferred or destroyed actually rests with me and the archivist here. We're the ones who look at various record series and decide whether or not they meet our values or our criteria for transfer to us. And some of those values are listed on the slide. First and foremost, we're looking at whether city records support the city's financial, legal, moral obligations and records that establish the city's rights against other parties, but we're also looking for records that establish an individual citizen's rights against the city. And that's really important. And sometimes that gets lost when people are talking about us as a heritage institution. Really, first and foremost, we're here to preserve and provide access to those records that prove the city's rights and obligations, but also help the citizens hold the government to account. For me, that's like our most important reason for being here. And then we also look at other records. We look at records with some other things in mind, like how well they preserve the city's corporate memory, how much documentary evidence they have of significant historical events, whether they contain unique or valuable information or complement and potentially complement various other record series coming from other boards and agencies. Now on the private side, the private acquisition side, I'm going to turn the next slide over to Kira, who will tell you a little bit about how we make decisions about those private sector records.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. So segueing straight into it, as Heather, so shifting over from city records to private sector holdings, we take in records from individuals, from family members, from whole families, businesses, and organizations. And so staff follow our collection mandate policy when we're acquiring materials. And really our focus is on, not surprisingly, Vancouver. So there's criteria here listed on your screen, going through, whether or not the records creator was based in or conducted a substantial portion of their activities in the city, had substantial relationships with the city and citizens, how much additional context those records would provide against city holdings, showing activities of the records creator and how they affected the city and the culture and character. Again, presence of documentary evidence for significant historical events, showing unique or valuable information, and as well the ability of the archives to preserve the materials in question. So, sometimes if we feel that, we get offered something that isn't quite suited for here with us, we might also suggest another institution as well. So whether that's maybe geography based, something's more related to Burnaby or family in Burnaby, we would suggest perhaps the Burnaby archives. Or there's also university special collections that have collecting focuses like local authors. So again, the archival community is pretty familiar with one another here, and so we try not to necessarily compete, and we might refer folks to another institution that sort of has more of a focus on certain material. Some stats for you for our holdings, which as the numbers sort of show, just the vast amount of materials that we have, from paper records, photographs, which include prints and slides and negatives, to maps, architectural drawings, audio and visual recordings, as well as our born digital records, or the records that we've digitized to make up sort of the digital preservation component that we're also doing here. So millions of records, and I won't rattle through all those stats for you, but just to take a look. For anyone in the audience who might already be familiar with archival research, you might sort of have seen some of this jargon up on your screen, and I won't go into it too in depth, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview that, unlike the library setting, which has material that's organized by subject, archival records aren't organized in that way. Our records are organized by provenance, or the creator, and we maintain those records how that creator had their materials organized and how they produced them and accumulated that material over time. So under this sort of concept of provenance and original order. And for instance, we don't rearrange or reconstitute files. So if there was a business with a filing system, we wouldn't reconstitute it. We would sort of keep it the context for which that business organized and produced the records. And records are otherwise then arranged in a hierarchical manner. So it's going sort of from the general to the specific. So we're breaking these records into sort of record groupings to help researchers understand the scope of material and sort of break down the records that are within the fond. And you might see this word here at the top, fond, being that top level, it's the creator body of the record. So it could be the personal papers of an individual, or the City of Vancouver fond is, for our city records, is one massive fond. And then records are sort of broken down further into series groupings. Within series, there's files. Within files, there's items. So bear in mind, not every fond will look exactly the same. My personal papers, for instance, would be very different from the City of Vancouver, which has hundreds of series, over 700 series groupings currently. But this sort of gives you a sense of the arrangement structure that we would have and some of the jargon that you might see from our database to sort of understand what record descriptions you're looking at. So for accessing the material that we have and figuring out what we offer is through our online database. So this is primarily a descriptive database where only a portion of our holdings have been digitized for you to see and download them directly. And our screen here just shows you some stats of the thousands of descriptions we have and the over 200 digital objects that we have. And the digital objects is just referring to the digital copy of a record. So whether that's a TIFF file for a photograph or an audio recording, that's sort of encompassed in the digital objects that we have. Again, it's a descriptive database. So what you would primarily see are descriptions of records that you would then access here at the archives. The digital objects are mostly attached to item level descriptions, but there's many other higher level aggregate descriptions, such as the file level, where we haven't gone in and digitized every single item within that file. And so you would come down to access that file of records and see what's inside. So, and just a shot here of the outside entry to the archives from our accessible sidewalk side, and a look inside here at our reading room space. So what can you see online? We've focused primarily on digitizing photographs, maps, and AV. So there's plenty of those to view, but bear in mind it's only a small portion of our holdings. So it's sort of tip of the iceberg, if you can sort of imagine what you can see on the surface of water versus picturing sort of what's below many other records. And that's pretty typical for an archival institution in terms of what they're able to digitize and provide online. versus the vast amount of material that they're holding and preserving. We do offer an on-demand reproduction service as well for folks needing a high quality TIFF file for a photograph, let's say, or we've shifted from photocopies to PDFs, but that's another way for researchers who are perhaps not in the city, maybe they're remote access or from a different part of the world, and they can get copies of records that way. So we do that for a fee, and that is a reproduction service that we do offer. In terms of research, we don't do in-depth research for folks. That's sort of up to you to conduct your own, but we certainly will provide you with an orientation to our reading room space, coming in, accessing material, how to navigate the database, and your research topics. Staff are able to sort of help you identify, well, what kinds of information you're looking for and what kinds of records then might give that information, or suggest particular phone or collections that would be relevant to your topic of study. So you can get in touch with us by email and phone, or come on down, and we're open sort of Monday through Friday, and no appointment is necessary to come and see staff and ask your questions. So I'll segue it over to Bronwyn.
Thanks, Kira. So obviously we're here because we're coming up to our 90th anniversary. And part of the 90th anniversary was we were figuring out how do we celebrate. It's not quite our 100th, but we want to make a good nod to 90th, but also work balance and what needs to be done on our day-to-day, ticking things over. So we devised this social media campaign, and it's our 90-day countdown to June 12th. And it started on March 15th. So we're kind of about a third of the way through the countdown. And the point of the countdown is to highlight 90 different records groups. So that could be different phone, different collection, or different city series. And it's to just highlight some of our lesser known and some of our more well-known collections and phone for that. And it was a lot of fun putting this together, because I learned a lot about stuff in our holdings that I had no idea we had. Gathered suggestions from the staff, other staff members here as to what would you like to highlight. And there were some that I thought, oh, I haven't even come across that. So it was a lot of fun to put together. And you can see all 90 days. I mean, we are counting down, so we haven't released them all yet, but you can follow us on Facebook, our Instagram, or Twitter. And the hashtag VanArchives90th is how you can see all of the posts for that. And also at the end of the 90 days, we will post a little video wall on our YouTube channel in case you're just wanting to have it, sit down and look at all of the different 90 record groups popping up without following us. But hopefully to entice you to follow us, and to also just to get to know our holdings a little bit more, I'm just going to highlight 5 different records groups that you will see in the 90 days. First one, of course, is council meeting minutes, and that's series 31. They are the official record of the discussion and decision-making of the governing body of the City of Vancouver. And they're important legally, but they're also important as a research source for a lot of researchers. This particular photograph is from the very first council meeting minutes, and that's from May 10th, 1886. We have the Pendergast Radio Collection Fawn. And this was the Pendergast Radio Collective grew out of a wave of Chinese Canadian youth activism in the early 1970s. And it began airing on Vancouver Co-op Radio in 1976, and it explored issues related to Chinese Canadian identity, history, politics, and art through interviews and reports, humor, drama, and music. And it ran until 1981. This particular phone contains the full run of the programs, as well as background research material used in making the programs. And these have all been digitized and are available through our database, and they are lots of fun to listen to. And it also just gives a little insight as to, what was happening in that community in the 70s, and in just a fantastic way. We have the Planning Department Maps, Plans, and Drawings series. Other than being eye candy for those of you who love maps and drawings, what these plans were created by the planning department or amended by the planning department in the course of drafting ideas, compiling information, preparing displays, or designing publication copies for related planning activities, including rezoning considerations. And this particular series has drawings and maps from 1925 to 1989. This particular drawing is of the Fairview Slopes land use in 1973. I love how beautiful it is. We have the John Girvin film, and who John Girvin was, he was a painter and decorator, and he operated his own studio. And this is an example of an individual's record group, and the records included show some of his career as a painter and decorator, as well as some personal papers of his. And his design project records include renderings, photographs, invoices, stencils, and sketchbooks. This one is one of my favorite things from his particular film, and it's the Vogue Theatre sign suggested color scheme mock-up from about 1940, which is just such a classic photo and color scheme. And then as our fifth little record that we're going to show here is the Yucho Chao Community Archive Collection. And this one was very exciting for us to receive. It was donated in 2021 by Catherine Clement. And it was Catherine's project where she tracked down photos, Yucho Chao photos, and scanned them for an exhibit, and then gave the original back to the family. So this is largely a digital-based collection. And Yucho Chao was a photographer who originally came from China, and he established a photo studio in Vancouver in 1907. And he took a lot of photos of people that have been traditionally excluded from the dominant narratives of Vancouver's history. So it's really exciting to get a bit more of a diverse records group in terms of photographs and seeing what groups of people are here other than just the standard British white photos that we tend to have a lot of. So this one is also exciting because there's a lot of metadata associated with the photos because of Catherine's particular project. With that, I will turn it over. That's just a little flavor of everything. I'll turn it over to question and answer.
So like I said at the beginning, anyone can pop their question into the chat. There have been a couple that have come in already, so I'll start with those, but we have plenty of time for questions, so if there's anything you really want to know about the archives, now's your chance. So one question that came in was, what was Major Matthews' main case to council for municipal archives, particularly when other large municipalities didn't have them, and followed up with, do all larger cities have them now?
That's a really good question. We didn't mention Daphne Slay wrote an entire book on Major Matthews. And I think just bottom line, he badgered the heck out of the city and kind of shamed him into it. They just didn't want to hear from him anymore. It's like, give him a little bit of money, make him the archivist, let him do his thing. One thing I didn't mention in history is that the city council, the city staff, the bureaucracy never did let Matthews touch city records. So it wasn't until 1972 when the building in Vanier Park opened that departments had a place to send those records. And then the archivist and the archive staff at the time started methodically cataloging those city records. Matthews, during his lifetime, up until he died in 1970, was kind of over here collecting the private sector stuff. And that was fine with council. It kept Matthews relatively happy. There was members of the community, and in particular the provincial archivist through the 30s and 40s into the 50s, who were great supporters of Matthews and did care a lot about preserving the city's early history and saw Matthews as the means to do that. So it kept those folks happy by letting Matthews do his thing and allowed the city to just continue on with their own records. In terms of other municipal archives, there are some that get started in the 50s, 60s, so they're almost as old as us. In the Lower Mainland, Matthews was really the only game in town until into probably my colleagues may challenge me, but I'm going to say into the 70s and 80s. It's particularly in the 80s and 90s, you start to see the other municipalities in the Lower Mainland have their own archives programs. Matthews was collecting all over, and there was nowhere else. Matthews was the guy. But then post Matthews, you start to see the archives in Richmond be developed in Burnaby and on the North Shore in both North Van and West Van. And so these community archives are springing up, and that's as Kira mentioned, we now have other institutions to direct people to, particularly if the collection geographically fits better there. And they're wonderful community archives that do their jobs really well, preserving their own community history.
Absolutely. Just a kind of question to build off of that. Kira had talked a little bit about the management of the holdings and the kind of the way in which that's done. In terms of archives, is there consistency and continuity in terms of how systems operate? Kind of like the Dewey Decimal System is standard in a library. Is there a similar parallel in the archives?
I'll unmute for that. Yes, and yes. Overarching that phone, that hierarchical structure, the jargon for series, files, items, that is used across archives in Canada. There might be different institutional differences amongst depending on the archives. So, for instance, when we number and we give a unique identifier to records, we use the phrase reference code. And so when someone comes in to request records, we need the reference code as part of the request slip. But other archives just might have different language around what they call that identifier. So it's not that, so the system is sort of there, but we institutionally might sort of differ in terms of how their own archives run and manage things.
Yeah, and that comes in part because archival holdings are unique. And so one kind of numbering system doesn't fit all, and we tend to follow, Kira didn't mention it, but we have this thing called the Rules for Archival Description, which is a descriptive standard that all archives in Canada use. There's an international one as well, but that just gives us guidance on things like your description has to have a title, and it has to have a date, and here are some rules for formulating that, and various note fields and all that kind of thing. But you don't, but because of the nature of the material, we can't call, we don't all have the same book that we all refer to by the same call number. And we are a veritable history as well of different numbering systems. We still use Matthew's numbering system for his photographs, but we use a different one for our own CVA collection. And a more or less standard one now, Kira, I think it's safe to say, for anything that comes in now where we're item numbering, but we're not going back then and applying those new numbering systems to things that already exist.
Yeah, not to like overcomplicate the question, but that's another point. So Heather mentioned RAD, the Rules for Archival Description, but RAD sort of came into the field in Canada at a certain time. And so material that obviously, like Matthews is a good example, where he was collecting earlier than that, he devised his own system for cataloging photographs, for instance. So instead of going back and redoing that, we've sort of left those systems as is. So I think a lot of archives out there also have these older legacy systems that can be, Matthews certainly can be quite quirky, and they're not necessarily going to overhaul every single thing. And so our organizations are also sort of working with past practices, and that has sort of evolved over time too.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating. There's a question kind of going back to, you talked a little bit about the process of what you can find online and then like what you can do if you come in for a visit. So if someone was, say, wanting to research a house that they lived in the 1960s that was torn down, how would they kind of go about researching it and finding photos of the house? And they provided an address too.
Oh yes, I see the question there. So like many things, and not all, so there's some things you can find online and some things you can't. So photographs, for instance, would be one that we really would point you to our database, and you can, we really have digitized a lot of photographs of houses and street views, since it is one that sort of, house history is a very common topic for us. So we have a lot of that available online to search for photographs. That said, we don't have photographs for every street in the city or every property, or you might see something for down the street, or maybe it's the next street over, but just not your house. So some of it is online. And then in other examples are ones where you would come down and access material. So property tax records are a good example. We have annual tax records going back from 1890s all the way up to 2005. but we haven't digitized or transcribed every single set of records for each year. And so just plugging in an address for your house won't bring up that immediate record. It would be one you'd come down and you'd have to sort of look year by year to find that record for that property. So for that person, for doing house history, we do have a guide. You can look online or get in touch with us and we can sort of give you a few more tips for what, if there's certain information you want all the information, sort of where you can go from there in terms of doing some research from home and then maybe coming down and visiting us too.
Amazing. Yeah. And we rely on the archives for our house tour that's coming up and getting information on those houses. So that's great to know. There's also a question in the chat about if someone was wanting to donate something to the archive, what kind of would that process look like?
Yeah, we accept donations sort of throughout the year. So there's no timeline or sort of deadline on our end. And all offers of donation are collectively reviewed and discussed by staff. So we hold regular meetings and we'll sort of talk about offers of donation. And there might be some back and forth depending on what the offer is for. But get in touch with us and we would ask you questions like, what are the records encompassing? What kind of subject matter do they show? Is it, if it's photographs, is it all prints or are there negatives? So sort of some of the physical preservation questions we would ask, what's the total volume of them? Is it just a small number? Is it quite a large amount? How did you get them? Sort of what's the context as to what they are and who made them? But those are the types of questions we would ask you about the material. And so there might be some back and forth, and then we would sort of go from there in terms of if we think it was a good fit for the archives. I will say we have, Bronwyn sort of pointed some of these larger collections like the Yucho Chow or Pender Guy Radio, which are quite large, but I think for the most part throughout the year, we're getting offers from donations that are from the average person and that they've come across something and it's these smaller items. And that's sort of, I would say, those are more often the kinds of questions we're getting from folks and not just these sort of more larger collections.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks for that. There's an interesting question here about what major developments over time have made it easier to search the archives. And they were wondering, will AI contribute to make it even easier now or in the future?
Yeah, Heather, I was going to wonder if you're going to unmute because you have more of the
Sure.
institutional
Briefly.
memory on the database.
Right. That's another really good question. In terms of major developments, well, anything to do with digitization, it just gets better and better. We had a discussion just the other day with a project Bronwyn is working on regarding city council minutes and how we use optical character recognition in order to make the text keyword searchable. And wow, the technology has just gotten better and better in terms of getting good quality OCR, and also in terms of just using something as simple as a program as simple as Acrobat, as opposed to specialized OCR software, which I think will go a long way to speeding up our process there. In time, there could be something that AI could help with that, no question. But there's also, in terms of artificial intelligence, there's a lot of interesting research going on now, including a project one of our digital archivists is involved in, to look at how AI can help us with description of born digital records. So one of our big problems here, when we get to the day when we'll be providing, think of countless Word documents and emails on, through our database somehow, being able to do things like privacy assessments is really key. It's easy to tell if you open a box and you see a bunch of file folders and you can recognize forms of records and know that, oh, gee, these are grievance files, or wait a minute, here's somebody's tax form, or these are applications that have all kinds of contact information and other personal information in them. That's really hard to do if you have, and time consuming if you have to open up every single electronic file. So the potential for using AI to analyze records and establish patterns and give us advice on whether or not we need to restrict some of those files is going to be huge, is a big thing that archivists are looking at these days. So it may make some of us obsolete someday, but probably not in the near future, just given how much analog records there are, for sure, to still provide to people.
Great, thanks. Kira, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No.
Cool. There was a question also, just someone being curious about kind of the background, like if you were wanting to get into archives as a career, what does that kind of look like in terms of an educational background?
Yeah, why don't we each talk about where we come from? Bronwyn, do you want to start?
Sure. So I did an undergrad in biology. So it's plant taxonomy, but now I'm doing record taxonomy. And then I did a library tech diploma and ended up working in archives out of that. And now I'm about 2/3 of the way through a master's in archives and records management.
And Kira?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I have an undergraduate background in history and women's studies, and that sort of segued me into getting a master's in archival studies. So there's a couple of different degree types that you'll see out in Canada now. UBC has a Master's of Archival Science, as well as the Masters of Library and Information, so MLIS. So UBC has a program. There's also programs at U of T and Dalhousie. So there's other master's and graduate level degree programs focusing on archival studies. So that's what I did, and come back to Vancouver to work here.
After volunteering here many years ago. And yeah, that's sort of that's the current standard in Canada. You really need a master's level degree in archival science, archival studies. And that was a big shift in the early 1980s. UBC had the first Masters of Archival Studies program in, I think, 1981 it started. And that really shook up the country, because up until then, archivists trained as historians. Usually you had an MA or a PhD in history. And you got, you went for 2 months or something like that, what was then the National Archives of Canada, to get your public archives, or the Public Archives of Canada at the time, to get your archive certificate. And it's what a lot of historians did, who then went and worked in archives. And then in the early 80s, you see this the professionalization of the training. And now that's kind of the de facto thing. It's some kind of archival studies degree, as opposed to a library science degree. So we tend to focus on either the UBC or the U of T grads here. Or on the paraprofessional side, as Bronwyn said, Langara, for example, has a really good library tech program, and those produce really good archival assistants.
Amazing. And with the City of Vancouver Archives, is there opportunities for volunteers? Like you said, like Kira volunteered, and like what do volunteers do? How do they help?
I just raised expectations, didn't I? We are really tight these days for the project planning and project supervision resources. So we haven't had volunteers in a while. We couldn't through COVID safely, and we have now turning our attention to backlog, and now the public service is picking up again. We really don't have the time. We've got one longtime volunteer who still comes in once a month or so. I'm hoping maybe in a year or two we're back to some kind of volunteer program, but they'll do a lot of things that we just don't have time to do, like some transcription, for example, leading to file or item level description. Can you guys help me out here in terms of other things?
Well, I was just going to point out, I volunteered about over 10 years ago. So it was a while ago when we had more regular volunteers coming in.
Yeah, for a while there was a whole army, and it got to be a bit much in terms of just making sure that they had work to do when they were coming in, and making it a meaningful experience. So we kind of scaled back pre-COVID, and then COVID threw the volunteer program off the rails. But it's that kind of thing, like rehousing things, transcription, that kind of stuff. Jeffrey Chong, who did a presentation for you just the other day, started off as a volunteer, and he had an interest in film, so we put him to work doing some like film QC, looking at film on the rewind, telling us what the content was, that kind of thing. We have to be a teeny bit careful because we are a union shop, Everybody but me is QP15. So, we have to be careful what kind of work we're giving to the volunteers, but we tend to make it stuff that would never get done if the paid staff had to get to it. But, stay tuned. If you're interested, reach out to me because I can certainly keep your name in mind for down the road.
Absolutely. In terms of someone was asking about the Vancouver School Board archive, that's a separate one of those community archives that Kira was mentioning?
Kira?
We do have school board records here. So they're not technically within the City of Vancouver phone because it's its own board. So it's in the VSB phone. That said, the record groups aren't necessarily a complete picture of VSB records. We haven't had a transfer of records from them for a long time, and we don't typically have records from individual schools. It more consists of board minutes and the sort of the more upper level administration and management of the board. There is also the VSB has their own archives as well, but it's not a physical place that you walk in. And my understanding is it's run by alumni, and so it's not like a place that you would go and do research. And I believe they focus more on photographs, so it's not necessarily again records from individual schools.
Absolutely. I just popped the link into the chat if anyone's curious about the school board archives. So
yeah, they have some neat sort of histories on school histories, as well as some of the schools that are no longer around. So they've gone through and created some histories around that. Yeah,
absolutely.
So we do have, we do have a few yearbooks from various schools. So we do tend to collect those just because those are useful research records for a lot of people.
Absolutely. So we have time for a couple more questions before we wrap up. So one question that just came in is, and tying it back to some of the things that you mentioned, the Ucho Chow collection. Obviously, there's also the BC Gay and Lesbian Archive that was recently kind of brought in and digitized, which is a great addition to the collection. What are there kind of histories and stories and collections and that from different areas that need more documentation and research and materials?
Kira, do you want to start off? Or?
Sure. Sorry. Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think there's certainly gaps in our holdings, and a lot of other institutional holdings across Canada are in the same position, where underrepresented groups and folks from more marginalized groups haven't been included in the archives. And in terms of today, there's some specific community archives that are doing that themselves. So you mentioned the BC GLA. So the BC Gay and Lesbian Archives collection was a community archives that was started by Ron Dutton in the late 70s, and he operated out of his home for many years. So he was collecting material because he found that there wasn't anyone else doing it. There's also out of the University of Fraser Valley, there's the South Asian Legacy Project. So they're specifically collecting and looking at records for a South Asian community in BC. So there are some community groups as well doing that work themselves, but we would certainly welcome records that represent more diverse Vancouver. And I think that's something that there are certainly gaps, and we just don't have those records in the same way that we have for more mainstream documentary holdings, and the ways in which folks see their records and see value in their records and offer it to the archives for safekeeping.
Absolutely. Anything else you wanted to add, Heather or Bronwyn?
Okay. Just that, we welcome contact from those groups, and we certainly, we go out to events like this to raise the profile of the archives and let people know we're here. But on the other hand, we're not here to poach any community's records. And some communities don't want to give us their records because, we are the government at the end of the day. And so sometimes activist groups, for example, don't necessarily want to approach us. We totally stand that. So it's a potential donor relations is a really it's a relationship building exercise, and sometimes it's just better for the community, better for the records, to have the community maintain them. If the community would like to donate them here, we would be more than happy and honored to have them and make them available, but it's not necessarily the right fit. I think we've done better over the last 10 years in particular than we did, through the 80s and 90s for sure. But, it's at the end of the day, they're the community's records, and it's their decision, how they want to have them maintained.
Absolutely. I know it just came up in our conversation artist talk last night, and it was just Jeffrey was so thrilled to find content, and like with the Yucho Chow collection coming in, and just seeing some of those pieces, and like you said, that there are gaps, and it's widespread. So but it's ultimately
we can all do better.
Yeah, and we're working on it, and yeah, it's great to see. So one final question is for each of you: do you have a favorite kind of item or record or collection that kind of just really is special to you, that you've come across during your work at the archives?
You guys take that one.
Currently, mine is, it will change as I work on different things. There's some tax assessment sheets from 1955, and up until recently, they were not very well described, or they weren't very discoverable, we'll say that. So they hadn't been really used by researchers, but we've done some work on that. We couldn't quite figure out why we had them or how they were created. And then I went down a little rabbit hole, made a blog post out of it. And so it was very exciting, because it's just fun to be able to research and figure out how those records, why they were created, and then how they also relate to other city records in our holdings.
The favorite record is sort of tough to sort of choose and narrow down. But I think collection wise, for me, the BC GLA has just been such a wonderful addition, and it was prized before it arrived here, but when it was with Ron, but now that it's here and I'm answering more research questions about materials, it's one of our more heavily accessed collections. Folks are very interested in looking at materials in it, and it's wide ranging in the scope of what Ron was collecting. Photos to posters to more ephemeral material, zines. And so I find the researchers coming down and looking at it are also just very interested in seeing it, especially younger folks who are looking through it are very pleased when they come across something. But in particular, there's a poster in the collection that I remember seeing a copy of on a family member's wall from the 90s. So I really love that poster, and it's neat when I saw it when it came here, that there was a copy of it, because I hadn't seen it in a poster form. And so it sort of just brought back some memories for me, especially, but I really love that collection.
I can't top that, Sarah.
Okay. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, and sharing a little bit about the history about that archive, because I too really, really appreciate that. With I've had some conversations with Ron as well, and it's such a treasure to have, and I'm so glad that people are using it. They know, right? And that's one of the things that, of course, we want to bring awareness to through this talk is the archives are there. Please reach out, and there's lots to discover in there. So thanks to Bronwyn, Heather, and Kira for joining us and for taking time to share a little bit about their work and this really special anniversary. Thanks everyone for joining. I just have a few kind of things to wrap up, and then we'll continue on with the rest of our afternoon. So I've put a few links in the chat. The archives website, which is a great starting place for you to look at if you're interested in more specific resources about heritage sites in Vancouver. The Heritage Site Finder is a great one to check out. Places That Matter community history resource that's accessible from the VHF website as well, and that's all about community nominated sites of importance. And then our website, of course, has our upcoming events. So just a few I wanted to mention, which kind of have tie-ins with what we talked about. So Dr. Sitwinder Baines, who's from the University of the Fraser Valley, is doing a talk next Tuesday at Highcroft, and she's talking about South Asian history in Vancouver. And as I mentioned earlier, our in-person house tour is returning this spring, June 4th. It's going to be focused on the neighborhood of Strathcona. So tickets are on sale now. If you want any information, our website, e-news, social media are best place to check. If you have any questions, feel welcome to reach out to me or any of our staff team. But yes, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon at one of the future events.